Hey guys, it's Madison Estes. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be reading and reviewing Elevation by Stephen King. But first I want to do a quick unopening because I just got Roadkill 6 in the mail today. Oh my gosh, it looks so good. Oh my gosh, it's so weird to finally be holding it. I love it. Look at the title page. Yes. And it came with a blank sheet of paper. So I'm on chapter 5 of Elevation, and so far I have mixed feelings about this book. What drew me into this story, besides the fact that it's Stephen King, was the premise. This story is about a guy named Scott who appears to consistently be losing weight despite making no dietary changes. Sounds familiar. Except instead of like the story Thinner, he does not appear to be losing any weight, he's just losing mass. I thought that the premise was really interesting. I thought it was very similar to Thinner, and I thought maybe Stephen King just had a different idea for the same concept and then he wanted to go in a different direction with it. That would have been preferable to the story that we've been getting so far. I'm about 100 pages into a 140-page novella and hardly anything has happened. Scott goes to see Dr. Bob, and Dr. Bob is just as casual as his name might suggest. Dr. Bob's like, hey Scott, maybe you should see a specialist. Maybe you should go see some scientists who can figure out what's going on with you. Dr. Bob is like the only logical character in this novel. Scott's like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to spend my last days being experimented on. Never mind the fact that what is happening to him is a truly unique experience that's never happened to any other human being in history of the earth. And whatever information they gain from studying him, regardless of whether or not they're able to save his life, could potentially benefit humanity for decades to come. But, you know, he doesn't want to be experimented on, so whatever. But he's at least going to make good use of that time, right? He's going to reconcile with people he's fighting with. He's going to reach out to old loved ones. He's going to do all the things he's always wanted to do. No. Instead, Scott seems to develop a weird fixation on his lesbian neighbors. And I don't mean a sexual fixation, I mean a let me show you how woke I am, let me show you what a great gay ally I am fixation. And at first that fixation doesn't feel too weird because they start off on the wrong foot. He makes a big deal out of the fact that, you know, their dogs have defecated in his yard, and, you know, the women seem to think that he's homophobic at first. But, you know, eventually they make up. Deirdre still doesn't like him, but he seems to have at least proven that he's not homophobic. He goes to their restaurant to support them. He argues with some guy in Castle Rock defending them, but Deirdre still doesn't like him, particularly after he got into the fight with that guy on Castle Rock while he was defending their honor. She said that he didn't need to do that and that he actually brought more animosity towards them. And Scott was just doing what he thought was right, but I ended up agreeing with her that Scott kind of overstepped and made things worse for them. But it doesn't really matter who's right in this situation because the truth is, I don't really care at all. I didn't pick up this book because I was looking for a story about a straight guy learning how to be a good gay ally. I wanted a fantasy novel about a guy that is progressively losing weight and trying to figure out what's wrong with him. Literally the only fantasy element that has appeared is the fact that he is competing in a race and he seems to be doing well despite the fact that he's a heavier set guy and he's not in shape because of the fact that he is losing weight. That's it. That's the only thing that's happened. I'm 100 pages into this novel that has such a high concept that is not being utilized at all. And considering I'm so far into the book, I don't see how it could possibly redeem itself or how I am possibly going to enjoy it. But I'm so close to the end, I'm just going to go ahead and finish it. Hopefully the story will redeem itself and I'll like it a lot more in the last act. I really don't think so though. I just finished Elevation and it was really unsatisfying. First of all, it was completely predictable. There was not a single surprise in this story. The only thing that surprised me is that apparently, spoilers, apparently winning a marathon cured the town's homophobia. that's ridiculous. That's the only thing that was surprising, because it's just a bonkers idea. It's literally just as silly and ridiculous as the idea of someone losing weight and then, you know, floating. In the story, it mentions that not everyone is going to overcome their homophobia, but I don't see how that could possibly make a big difference if that's, you know, embedded in the town's culture. The only thing I can think of that maybe would have made a difference is if Deirdre had won like a hunting competition. For Deirdre to like win a hunting competition, they would have to be like, oh, she's apparently very pro guns. Maybe, you know, there's not as many differences between us as we would have originally thought. That I could see maybe could make the town warm up to her a little bit. I definitely don't think that it would cure their homophobia. I think it would be more along the lines of, well, she's one of the good lesbians. That's kind of like the more realistic mindset that I think would happen. But like a marathon, I thought that entire subplot and the resolution to that was ridiculous. I get that like the character apparently needed to do something in order to like make amends with his neighbors, and I guess to find a way to help them be accepted in the community. It just wasn't realistic to me, and it felt really forced. As did his sudden friendship with Missy and Deirdre. It felt incredibly forced. By the end of the story, they were telling him that they loved him, and it just felt like it was out of nowhere. I understand that some time had passed between like the end of the marathon and them becoming friends and then the end of the novel, but it just felt so rushed. That whole third act felt so rushed. The pacing was so fast, and it just made everything that happened feel really shallow and unimportant. And it was predictable. It was so predictable. I knew just about everything in the story that was going to happen. And I can't say that the execution was good enough that it made it worth reading it. It really wasn't. So if you're like me and you're interested in the premise of this novel, I would recommend checking out Stephen King's novel Thinner. In addition to the fact that that story is actually interesting and written well, it also has an explanation for, you know, where the affliction comes from, and it has a satisfying resolution. Unlike this story. Also, I would recommend checking out Joe Hill's short story Pop Art in the collection 20th Century Ghosts. It's a little bit different, but it has a similar premise and a similar feel to this story, except it's much better and the story is told in far less words. It's about a boy who becomes friends with an inflatable person, and it's a coming-of-age story, and the friendship that develops between them is far more sincere than any of the friendships in this novel. Seriously, Elevation was just such an unsatisfying story. I would give this 2 stars out of 5. The writing style was really good. There was a few parts I was interested in, and there was some attempt at characterization, even though a lot of times it fell flat for me, and the relationships between the characters also fell flat for me. But I do see some literary merit here, and I do think that some people might enjoy this story, as long as you go in with the expectation that the story is not really going to focus that much on the premise, which to me is kind of a big deal, especially when the premise is like this high fantasy concept that's really interesting, and the story barely really makes use of that. But, you know, other people might still find some enjoyment in this. It just didn't do it for me, and I wouldn't really recommend it. Some people say that Stephen King is losing his touch, and I don't necessarily agree or disagree with that. I do think that because he's writing stories that aren't necessarily horror stories, that he's kind of losing touch with his fan base a little bit. But this story doesn't really help in that, you know, it's marketed as a fantasy story, and yet what we're getting is like a political feel-good story. That's another criticism. A lot of people are like, oh, Stephen King's too political. He's always been political. His stories have always had political commentary, almost all of them, even as early as The Stand and The Dead Zone. Dead Zone is literally about a psychic who assassinates a presidential candidate because he's going to start World War III. That's very political. The difference is that The Dead Zone is actually a good novel, and it also integrates the political elements in a way that feels natural to the story. Unlike this story, where the political elements was the story, it was the entire story, and the fantasy elements barely had any place in this story. One of the hallmarks of a good fantasy or horror story is if you can take all of the supernatural or fantasy elements out, is it still a good story? This book has caused me to think about that concept in a different way. If you can easily take all of the fantasy and horror concepts out of your story, do those concepts even belong in your story? One last thing I want to add is that I usually go into Stephen King novels with very high expectations. As I was reading this story, and it took me weeks to read this story, this 140-page story that's like barely novella length, because it was just so slow and so uninteresting, and every day my expectations kept getting lower and lower, and yet I got to the end of this novel and I only feel relief that I'm done with the novel. I just derived no enjoyment from this at all. So I'm kind of bummed that I didn't like this story more. I've kind of been in a reading rut in general. Just the last few books I've read have not been enjoyable at all. So I think what I'm going to do is read some Joe Hill, because so far he has not disappointed me. And I might read some Carlton Mellick soon. But let me know what you think. And if you have any suggestions for like a good like fantasy or horror novel to get out of a reading rut, please leave a comment in the description box below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On this channel, I post book reviews, writing advice, horror content, and vlogs. And I just edited a horror anthology called Roadkill 6, Texas Horror by Texas Writers. I'll include a link for this in the description box below if you want to check it out. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you later.